I believe we are live. So, welcome to another episode of Carta de Viner, the Friday Book Club. And tonight we have with us Ron Mackay for an interesting conversation of the Kilt Behind the Curtain. I will allow Nicola to go and introduce Ron and tell us a little bit about the author, the person who wrote this interesting account, and then we can go into what we normally do, as in a very chilled conversation about the memories of those days. Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Ron. As a boy in Scotland in the 1950s, Ronald Mackay delivered medicines, worked on farms and in forests, and hitchhiked to Morocco and back in 25 days. After leaving the Morgan Academy in 1960, he worked in banana plantations in the Canary Islands. Later, to cover his university expenses, he graded skins for the Hudson's Bay Company, fished cod off the Scottish coast, and worked as a tunnel tiger inside Ben Cruachan, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, helping build the hydroelectric power station. In Romania, from 1967 to 1969, Mackay was the British visiting professor at Bucharest University and taught briefly in Sofia, Bulgaria. Subsequently, he worked throughout Northern and Eastern Europe. From the mid-1970s, he worked first in Mexico and then in Canada. While teaching program evaluation at Concordia University in Montreal, he conducted projects from Canada's east coast to its west coast, as well as all over the Canadian Arctic. He's also held posts in Toronto, Edinburgh, and Singapore, and run a working farm in central Ontario. From the 90s, as a development specialist, Mackay helped apply agricultural technologies in Bangladesh, India, the Philippines, Tanzania, the Middle East, and throughout Latin America. He and his Peruvian wife, Viviana, managed a vineyard in Argentina. After retiring in 2012, they first lived near Rice Lake, Ontario, but since 2022 spend summers in the Netherlands and winters in Tenerife. Mackay has written plays and short stories. He has published 4 memoirs in English, A Scotsman Abroad, Fortunate Isle, a memoir of Tenerife, and The Kilt Behind the Curtain, as well as Windows on My Worlds. The book we will be discussing this evening is The Kilt Behind the Curtain, A Scotsman in Ceausescu's Romania, which was published in 2020. So, wow, what an impressive and amazing life you've led so far. Perhaps I could just kick off the discussion by asking, for those listening who haven't yet read the book, what is The Kilt Behind the Curtain about?
Just so you know, you're talking on mute, but that happens. So just bear with me. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I unmute here. There we are.
Oh, great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, there we go. So,
you.
do you want me to ask that question again, or are you ready to go?
I can go. I can repeat it. The book is about the 2 years that I spent in Romania as the appointed exchange professor in phonetics at the Department of English and Foreign Languages and Literatures at Bucharest University. That was from 67 until 69. That's basically what the book covers.
And I was wondering, when did you write the book, and sort of what was the experience of writing it like? How long did it take you? That sort of thing.
I wrote the book by surprise. I thought I was going to write a single chapter about a very eventful period of my life, and 3 months later, I had the manuscript completed. I sent it to a very good friend of mine who was associated with Contemporary Literature Press at Bucharest University, George Sandulescu, who at that time was retired from his position as the director of the Grace Kelly Memorial Library in Monaco, and he arranged to have it published by Contemporary Literature Press within a couple of months. I believe Lydia Pianu is the principal person in that press, and she was the one who directed it through the press. So it took me about 3 months to write. Dino wouldn't give me time to edit it. It was published in a much longer form than The Kilt Behind the Curtain, and probably about 5 years earlier. I edited it into a shorter form in 2020 and published it on Amazon without the photographs.
Mm. I know you consulted letters that you had written to your mother, but had you also kept notes along the way? I mean, how difficult or easy was it to remember things as you were writing?
I've never kept a diary. I've never written notes to myself. I never thought I was going to write about Romania. My mother kept the letters because she was a keeper of things. Anything that her children sent her, she kept. And in fact, there were very few of them. I had no difficulty remembering these 2 years in Romania because they were very intensive years. It was a difficult time for Romanians. It was a difficult time for relations between East and West. Romania was very firmly in the Soviet camp at that time. And I think I only made a mistake in names in 2 places. And Dino Sandulescu, whom I call Dino, others call George Sandulescu, he was able to correct these 2 names for me, but there was nothing that I didn't remember very clearly. And still, I remember many of these episodes very clearly.
Serena, did you want to?
I just one of the things that struck me, and I think you kind of alluded to, is how much it actually marked you. So it's something that definitely stayed with you and had a real impact on your psyche as such, much
Yes,
more than your potentially other experiences abroad. And I would like
yes.
to know a little bit more about that.
Well, that's a good question because it marked me in 2 ways. It marked me while I was there because living in Romania, living in Bucharest, teaching in the university, living in an apartment uh, on my own was a difficult experience for political reasons, not for economic reasons. I had plenty of lei, but it was a very difficult time to buy things. I had money, but there was nothing to spend it on. It was difficult to buy food. It was difficult to buy the normal necessities of life. I was told that I shouldn't leave the city, and I decided I was going to ignore that instruction from the rectoria of the university. So I did get to know the rest of the country very well and loved it. I loved traveling in Romania. I loved meeting Romanians, even though most of them were unwilling to speak to me because there was a law of association at that time, which made it difficult for them to make any contact whatsoever with a foreigner, even from the East, not just from the Western Europe. But it marked me in another way. When I came back to Britain, the experience had been so different from anything that anybody else that I met had lived that there was no way of talking about it.
Mm.
So it
Yes.
stayed inside me all of these years until I wrote the book.
Mm. Um, what actually prompted you, based on that, to apply for the post in Romania in the first place? Aside from the fact you obviously saw it was advertised, but yeah, what actually prompted you to go forward with that?
I was about to sit my finals at Aberdeen University, and I had taken a general degree in arts. It was a master's degree. The first degree in Scotland was a master's degree in those days. And I had taken a break, gone out and bought a newspaper, came back, looked at the jobs column, and saw exchange professor required for Bucharest University in phonetics. And I thought, Bucharest University, let's have a look at that. So I got a map out, an atlas, and I saw the same map that I had sat in front of in my English class in school for several years. And right in the middle was Transylvania and the city of Cluj. And I thought, I think I would like to go to Bucharest and travel around Romania. So I went to one of my professors and had to ask, what is phonetics? And he told me, and I became a phonetician in very short order. And I was given the job for other reasons. It wasn't because of my ability in phonetics. But that's how it came about. It was purely accidental. It was purely a desire for adventure and the memory of that map sitting on the wall in front of me in the Morgan Academy with Cluj right in the center.
If I may just interject there, I am rather impressed with two things there. First of all, just the translation for those of us who are, well, those of you who are of a different generation. An atlas is actually a book that we used to use to find places in the world. and then from my own perspective, and a little jibe at my husband, there is such thing as more of a detailed map of Central and Eastern Europe than just that red thing on the board that you guys were taught at school. So there you go.
Yes.
I
Well,
have
talking of maps, if I can just mention for a moment, in Romania, there was only one map available to the average person at that time, and it was actually issued by the tourist board, and it was inaccurate. And I found myself that British surveyors had surveyed Romania, maybe 50 years earlier, and I was able to buy detailed maps in London in a map shop in High Holborn and take them back to Romania with me.
Yep.
I have kind of a more detailed question about I suppose your experience of the teaching side of things, and perhaps this is something Serena could maybe come in relation to her experience of being at school in the communist era. But what would you say about the range of English or American literature that was taught at Bucharest University at the time, given the restrictions?
It was as good as any Western university might offer. The teaching was as good. The students were probably better because competition was extreme in Romania at that time. Young Romanians knew that if they didn't make an effort, they would, after graduation, be sent off to some very distant village because you didn't apply for jobs under communism. You were sent to take up a job that the government gave you. So the teaching was excellent. As far as I could see, the literature was not culled for any ulterior motive. The good authors, the classical authors, were all taught and easily accessible to students and professors alike.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's worth actually stating that this was potentially valid for the period when you were in Romania, so the 60s, the 70s.
It wasn't like that for you, right?
Whereas when I joined school later on, so for my generation was the last one to leave under communist Romania, so I was 11 at the revolution. Which means that we weren't really allowed a lot. So what we did have access to was what was in the libraries or personal book collections that people may have had, but there were also a lot of killings done by the police for foreign books. So, for example, my grandma's Charles Dickens was I only had volume 1 of David Copperfield because they confiscated the second volume because it was way too much. So things like that, very ridiculous in today's world, but yeah. So classical, definitely we had access to. My parents would have had a lot more access than I had to books.
There certainly would have been some books that would not have been allowed. George Orwell's Animal Farm or 1984 would not have been allowed. So maybe I was a little bit too hurried in saying that there was no control. There certainly would have been control of politically contentious books, but I was thinking more of literature, of rather than literature that deals with political themes.
Yeah. There is one observation from Alina in the chat. So Alina and Petra, thank you very much for your statement. So she finds the conversation fascinating, and she's asking, when was the last time that you visited Romania? Would you like to visit again? And if you did, is there a message you would feel would be useful for Romanians today to hear about Romania? Could be seen as a good country for the world? A little bit of a statement there.
That's a very complex question. Let me just take the last part of that first. I would say that my experience of Romania in the mid to late 60s showed that Romanians were some of the most admirable and well-educated people that I had ever met. Now, remember, I was in a university in the capital city. Students were selected. There was a selective process, and the curriculum was not watered down. So you had to work. You couldn't just go and find easy courses the way that students do today and end up with a degree, which doesn't mean very much at all. The degree courses in the faculty I was teaching in and other faculties, because I did meet other people, were of very high quality. Teachers were of high quality, and so were students. So I developed an enormous admiration for my students, who were the people that I met most. We can go into going out into the countryside and peasants in the countryside and in the market at another part of the conversation. But I was extremely impressed by the quality of education given and the level of education and the level of intellectual thought of the professors in the university, and their curiosity. If occasionally you did have a conversation, the questions were penetrating. They weren't superficial questions.
That's very nice to hear. Thank you.
Is it back to me, or
yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
I think Alina has a follow-up question there. But yeah, I can carry on with my many questions. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the fact of Romanians, when you were there in the 60s, not being freely able to socialize with Westerners, and greatly fearing, as you say, responsibility because it could lead to liability, guilt, and then to punishment. And I wondered whether you could relate this to maybe the more light-hearted incident of the crêpe Suzette cinders that were served to you on one occasion, and then perhaps in relation to something a little more sinister.
Well, I think it's important to remember that the way that the communist countries were governed, the way that Romania was governed, was by absolute control. So everybody had an identity card, and I was shown an identity card by one of my students at one point, and on it, she claimed that there was all kinds of information which was used to determine what she had access to in terms of ease of going to university, jobs, ease of getting a passport. And these were ethnic. There was, as you probably all know, Romania and the whole of that part of Europe had linguistic and ethnic minorities spread throughout the country. Schwabs and Saxons and Magyars and Bulgars, Turks. So one of the ways of controlling Romania from the Romanian nationalist perspective, although nationalism was a word that you couldn't use in those days, was to determine who was ethnic Romanian and who was other than ethnic Romanian, because Romania felt it had been let down by Germans and Saxons and Hungarians and Bulgarians at periods before the Second World War. So the tendency was to control as much as possible. That included making sure that Romanians did not speak to foreigners, because foreigners were so, people from outside the country, not ethnic minorities now, foreigners were under suspicion of being subversive. So it was assumed, for example, that when I took up the position, that I was an agent of the British government. Anybody who came in from another country was considered to be a foreign intelligence agent. Now, there was a law which said if you, as a Romanian citizen, whether you're an ethnic German or an ethnic Romanian, an ethnic Hungarian, you have to report any conversation that you have with a non-Romanian citizen to your Communist Party base. All people were related to a Communist Party base where your files were kept. And that conversation would then be recorded on your file in the Communist Party base. Now, the last thing you wanted as a Romanian professor or Romanian student was to have anything incriminating on your file. And so the law existed, don't speak to foreigners. If you do, report it. It was much easier to keep away from foreigners, and then there was no chance of anything incriminating being put on your file. And basically, the 2 years I was there were spent in 85% isolation from the average Romanian. Those who spoke to me, I would imagine, were likely to be either informants for Securitate or Securitate themselves, or people who just didn't care and thought that they could get something beneficial from making friends with me without having to pay the price to the Communist Party. So it was a very difficult to have. And you talked about responsibility. That's a slightly different matter. Responsibility, let's start with it in the university. Students were responsible for learning, and professors held them to that responsibility, and students performed extremely well. There were no discipline problems. There were no learning problems. If anything, students became slightly more demanding than was tolerable at times, because they wanted so much from their professors. The more they got, the better off they would be, the better they would perform in their examinations, and the better job they would get, because jobs were handed out by ranking students in terms of their performance. So there's responsibility taken by students in order to get a job. Now, there's another kind of responsibility. Responsibility in a communist country where there is always somebody above you to blame you if something goes wrong, then you try to avoid taking responsibility. So if I were driving in Bucharest, I didn't have a car of my own. I was often given the consul's car, and I parked it. The area I parked it in belonged to some policeman. His job was to patrol that area. The last thing he wanted was a car with CD plates on it. And so he would tell you it was illegal to park there just to move you away so he wouldn't have responsibility. So that if anything did go wrong, it wouldn't go wrong on his patch. But the funny incident that you mentioned there, the crepe Suzette, Patitilor, I think was the Spanish name. I'd never heard of it before I went to Romania, but I sometimes dined alone in the Atini Palace, which always
Wow.
had food. You could always get a meal in the Athene Palace. In other places, you might not find much more beyond brown bread and cheese. But I took the Foreign Office leader of the exchange team who came from Britain to negotiate the bilateral exchange, the cultural exchange between Romania and Britain. I think it was in 1968 to dinner. He invited me, but I took him to the Athene Palace Hotel, and it was a very quiet evening. I think we were one of 3 or 4 tables with people at the time, and in the Athene Palace and in other restaurants as well, big restaurants like the Athene Palace, everything was weighed. Every meal came identical and the identical amount of food on the plate. And once the chef had given it to the waiter and the waiter came out of the kitchen with it, it was his responsibility. It was no longer the responsibility of anybody else. And you couldn't take it back to the chef. Well, Platitilor, the way that the Athene Palace served them was by pouring tuica or brandy onto the Platitilor, the crepe Suzette, and lighting it and bringing it to the table with a beautiful blue flame around it. Well, the waiter poured too much alcohol onto the crepe Suzette, and by the time he set it down on the table, there was virtually nothing left except two big black cinders. And I knew exactly what had happened. He couldn't take it back to the kitchen. He was just going to leave it. He was going to leave his mistake on our table, and now it became our problem to resolve. And I resolved it by eating mine and watching the head of the British delegation from London trying to eat his and wondering what had happened to the Athene Palace food standards.
Going back to your statement about Romania was essentially ruled by full control, and your mentioning of the ID cards. I put in the chat a copy of my matricola, which is a number that would be displayed on your chest and on your left arm. The left arm had to be both your shirt but also the outer coat, and the chest would be just your normal uniform. But essentially that number was for any student at any age, which meant that even if you didn't have an ID card, the state had a possibility of controlling you. So if anybody heard you making a joke or talking the wrong thing, they could essentially take your number and report you to the nearest thing, which sounds insane in today's world, but it is something that definitely I lived through. It was, for me, it was really interesting reading the book because, and I heard you mentioning just now brown bread, it very much brought to life the accounts of my grandparents and my parents who lived through that generation. So it was their younger years.
Yes.
I was born in the generation that knew nothing. So at the end of the 70s, in 78, from the 80s onwards, Romania entered a period of austerity, which meant that even the few things that you experienced completely and totally disappeared. So the brown bread you mentioned, I knew from accounts. I had never seen what it looked like until very, very later in life when I first touched brown bread. So it's very difficult to read about those things, and it kind of ties up to.
Well, just for a moment to come back to controlling factors, your mother would have been taught at home when she was a child by her mother and father her biography. Children in the 60s, when I was there, learned their biography by heart at home and didn't depart from that biography. They couldn't speak spontaneously. Much of their biography would have been doctored by their parents to avoid anything embarrassing or anything politically damning for the parents. And that is how my students came to the university as well. They had learned their biographies by heart, and they knew them as you might know a piece of poetry.
Yes, inside out. And it's about the dual personality that you had to display at all times, and the ability to feel at ease in two different characters altogether that often were at conflicts with each other. So in my family, my grandma was very much a churchgoer, and we had contacts with the foreigners, and we had to hide that part simply because it was just all completely against the state. There are other people that are in our groups that had parents or grandparents in prison, etc., etc. So at all times, you were aware of who was in front of you and what you could or could not talk about. From a very, very young age. And that's perhaps one of the most difficult things to understand when you haven't lived those kind of circumstances.
Yes, and you're talking about Romanian to Romanian. And you imagine my situation. I came in as a foreigner, so there was even a bigger fence between me and two Romanians of the same age, in the same class, living in the same building. So it was even worse for them, and of course worse for me in a sense as well, because I was that much further cut off from the average Romanian.
Yeah, absolutely. Alina was asking her follow-up question was very much around Romania doing a very poor job at educating the new generations about our own history. So one of the reasons why I found your book fascinating is because essentially it helps me piece together parts of my history that I only know from accounts of either family or friends. I've never had the luxury of studying that period of time in the educational system, because after the revolution, I remember my high school teacher getting to the part of contemporary Romania in history and saying, I'm just going to be very open and honest. I am not going to go through the books with you simply because the books are full of lies. If you want to have a conversation, we can have a conversation, but there's nothing from the books that we can actually study together for this period of time. So her question is essentially saying, well, we see today strange nostalgia of the young for a communist Romania they did not live in. What would you say to today's fans of communism if you had a class of students in front of you today? What would you tell them based on your own experience?
Today, people who are pro-communist are fundamentally ignorant. That is the truth of it. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean that in a literal way. They do not know what communism was, how it came about, or how it established itself and gained control. So I don't think Romania today is probably much worse than much of the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Canada, and many other countries which have never lived under communism. They've never lived under a totalitarian government. They don't know the brutality of it. They don't know the reality of it. And they fall for much of the rhetoric. What is it? Equality, fraternity, and
Yes.
equality, fraternity, and
Fraternity.
the,
You put me on the spot there.
yes. Anyway, you know what I mean. Um, Life
And
is
liberty.
much more complicated than those who believe in utopias would want it to be. There will never be a utopia. There never has been a utopia. Communism has never reached the level and never could reach the level of a utopia. So I think I wouldn't try to persuade them about a particular country. I would maybe talk to them about the differences that have always existed between people and between their aspirations, and point to the fact that Romania today is probably very little different in terms of the lack of education among the young as England, Scotland, the Netherlands, other countries. Young people today don't read. You mentioned that at the beginning. They don't read. They pick up tropes. They pick up easy things to say, but there's often very little basis or historical understanding behind what they're talking about.
Thank you.
I was wondering, just to continue on this theme of, what it was like in terms of daily life, eating, living conditions, that sort of thing. One of the revelations for me in the book was that under communism, private homes were confiscated and divided up into multi-family units, meaning families were restricted to one room and had to share their kitchen and bathroom with other families or other people. And so there was this oft asked question, how many rooms do you live in?
Yes. Yes, that would be the case for houses. There were also apartments built, and the apartments were built so that individual families could live in apartments. So I was in apartments where a single family lived, but I was also in houses which had been owned by the people who took me to the house, and they were confined to a single room and shared the facilities with others who had been given their space after the communists took over in 1949.
Yeah, and
Another
again,
thing-
just for history's sake, that was a very specific thing that we actually had in common with the Nazist Germany, and where they took over, and they did precisely the same approach, but it was something that happened in early years of communism, so 50s, 60s, and then later on that no longer happened. So I grew up in a very comfortable 3-bedroom flat. We didn't have to share that with anybody. We had a different policy introduced when I came about, which was every family had to have a number of children. And again, I was an exception because I was an only child, and God only knows how that actually managed to be maintained. But most of my friends would come from families of 5, 7, 6 children. you had very few families that only had an only child in the neighborhood.
The other thing that that I found surprising, because I just hadn't heard of this before, was that you say that in all towns and villages in Romania, loudspeakers issued news bulletins and kind of military music from dawn till dusk. And that's what I'm relating to a particular experience in Cluj, the road trip with your mother.
Yes. Yes. I believe at the time you weren't allowed to have a radio in that time in the 60s. I'm not 100% certain that that is correct, but I believe that the radios were switched on in the square and in the street. So that is where the information came from. There was always the fear that you would tune in, if you had a private radio, to Radio Free Europe, which was or Western. I think it was financed maybe by the CIA, and it gave information which was counter-revolutionary. It gave information about defectees, and it gave information about difficulties that the East European and Central European countries were having. But I had previously lived in Spain under Franco, and they did exactly the same. If it wasn't illegal to have a radio, it was the fact that people were too poor to have radios. And so the government found it easy to control information by simply putting loudspeakers in the streets so that everybody got exactly the same information, and only the information that the government wanted to promulgate.
So Jason's just put in the chat that BBC World Radio could be received in Romania now. I believe that that would be the case, however, under agreed censorship. And as far as my own experience is concerned, I do not ever recall hearing anything such as BBC or anything else other than Romanian radio. There were no foreign ever programs.
No, the radio, the government used jammers to jam foreign radio broadcasts, and they also used jammers to jam the Radio Free Europe. I can remember one evening, the following day, I had quite an important presentation to make, and the technicians who used the tape recorders and the loudspeakers and things, I needed to speak to them. So I went to the university quite late in the evening, pretty close to a time when I thought it might even have been closed. I was just hoping that they were there. And they were listening in the language laboratory to a foreign broadcast. And they almost had a fit when I walked into the room. They were visually and physically petrified that I had gone in and caught them listening. So as technicians, they knew how to get that kind of thing. So Jason is probably right in that sense, that if you knew how to do it, you could get it. But 99% of the population would not be able to get a foreign radio broadcast.
There was one more difference. If I recall the conversations with my colleagues from Timișoara, because they were in a city that was near the border, and Timișoara was very much considered to be a little bit of a world in itself because of the old ties to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc. They would actually have a lot more access to both goods and various services in terms of TV programs or even radio programs. And it was the same along the south borders for those that could watch whatever was transmitted across into Bulgaria. Whereas in Ploiești, where I'm from, we were much less able to to reach those because it was further away and it was much more censored. So the only two programs that I recall my grandmother listening to, and we were doing that very much crouched on the floor, ear against the radio, were the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe on the lowest possible volume setting so that the neighbors couldn't hear it because the walls were paper thin.
Yes,
So.
yes.
I think Alina posted another question, otherwise I can go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was wondering how you felt when it was eventually revealed to you the true purpose of your role in Bucharest, and the fact that it was actually related not to language and literature, but to commerce and trade. And that's in relation to your meeting with Mr. Jones at the Foreign Office.
Yes. Yes. I don't think he thought he was telling me a secret. I think I was maybe just a little bit naive as a student. Had I been a student of economics, as Sorina is, I probably would have understood that relationships between countries are more about economic interests than they are about cultural interests. And the role of culture is simply as the red carpet along which economists and economic interests are paraded. So it was an insight to me because I hadn't quite been aware of it. I was maybe a little bit naive in terms of politics and in terms of economics, and maybe I should have known better about relationships between East and West, but I didn't. And so when he mentioned that to me, it made sense of quite a lot of other things that I saw, of the businessmen who came by, of their interest in talking to me. And frankly, I didn't help them very much because most of that contact was at the British Embassy Club, which was simply a room behind the embassy in the old mews, and you had to pay for drinks. And I was so badly paid by the British government that frankly, I couldn't afford to go and spend a shilling or two to buy a can of beer and have a conversation with someone that I was not particularly interested in. So I tended not to go much to these, but I did make friends with some business people. I remember helping one quite considerably. He was interested in exporting from Romania certain kinds of goods. And it was made easier because as Britain made economic relations with Romania, Romania would not pay Britain in money for goods that Romania wanted. Romania would exchange goods that they wanted to get rid of, and they may well have been goods that Britain had no interest in receiving. So there was the problem for Romania. It didn't have money. It was producing things that other people might not want, and so it had the difficulty, or Britain had the difficulty of ending up with large quantities of objects or produce that they didn't know what to do with. So the businessman I helped was helping Britain solve that problem. When Britain got a ship full of something that they didn't know what to do with, he was the kind of person who was getting rid of it for them. Another
What kind of
business, yes?
Sorry, I was just wondering what sort of goods are you talking about at this point that they
Well,
wanted to get rid of?
I don't remember exactly what it was that he was responsible for, because it was relatively easy to get rid of food. Romania built a huge transport company, refrigerated transport, and the food Romania produced was simply put into these transport trucks and taken to the West. And that's why it wasn't available to Romanians, because it was being taken out to the West. And of course, food is always easy to sell in the West. I was trying to think of what it was that I think Romania was doing things like canning vegetables, and they didn't do it very well, or their quality control wasn't very good, either in the terms of the material they put in the cans or of the shape of the cans once they were finished. And so I think it was canned goods that Raul had to try and get rid of when Romania was exchanging these poorly produced canned goods for something that Britain was exporting of value to Romania.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Considering the fact that my best image of a Romanian supermarket contained rows and rows of empty shelves, a corner where there would be a little bit of spilled oil in the background because that's the only oil that would remain, and maybe some Chinese prawn crackers bags forgotten on the shelf. That's pretty
Yes,
much it. And
yes,
because I was in Ploiești and we had the whole factory of detergent, then we would have Dero, which is
yes.
the only detergent that would be available to wash your clothes in. So it was well known in my area that we were from there because nobody needed to wash their cars because
Yeah,
it just took the rain to come in and the cars would
yes,
be clean because we were 10 minutes away from the factory.
right.
So the plume helped.
Well, I gave up shopping basically and bought everything I needed in the Piazza Romana from the farmers market once or twice a week. So my diet became very restricted, but at that age, I didn't mind. I had been a poor student in Aberdeen, and so I didn't really mind what I ate. And often I was invited out to diplomatic dinners, embassy dinners in the American embassy, the British embassy, the Swedish embassy was very friendly as well. So I could always count on getting one good dinner a week.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I mean, you've sort of been covering this throughout the conversation, but what your abiding memories of your time in Romania are that you haven't already uh, discussed, and also perhaps thinking about that in relation to your enjoyment of cultural events and your feeling of other Romanians that you were in the vicinity of also equally enjoying these cultural events. And I quote you as saying, I'd never experienced the effortless dignity of bearing, elegance of dress, and cultured, informed conversation that I experienced in Romania.
Yes, that's true. And that's very true. I had the good fortune in my first year of having had Securitate put a very sophisticated, beautiful young woman as my informant. And circumstances came about that she let me know that she was my informant because um, I was going to stop seeing her otherwise. And so we agreed that I would continue to see her for the rest of the year, the following 6 months. And then, of course, knowing that she was an informant, uh, we could go to public events. We could go to the symphony together. We could go to the cinema. We could go to a concert. We could go to an organ recital in one of the churches. And I was free to do that. I knew that I was not putting her at risk. And she was sophisticated and educated and an intellectual. And I we didn't socialize with other people at these events. Romanians didn't at that time, as far as I could see, socialize in public. And so if I went out with her, the event itself was culturally beautiful. Looking around, you could see that you were among people who were well educated and appreciating what they saw, and their dress was from the pre-war, very, very worn, but they dressed beautifully. So you were in fine, elegant company. So that was always a joy in Bucharest to go out to one of these these events. Another time, I made friends with Ivan Denish, who was a journalist, a novelist, puppeteer. He was one of the first puppeteer theater people in Bucharest. He was from Timișoara. He was a Hungarian, and with the movement of borders, you could end up as a Hungarian in Romania, which happened to him. And one afternoon, he invited me over to his house, and he had also, without telling me, because Romanians didn't tell you anything that they didn't want you to know, he had invited a cellmate of his from the prison in Gerla, where he had spent half a dozen years, to come and talk with us and to sit in Ivan's apartment. He had an apartment to himself and his wife and his son, Adan, to listen to these two gentlemen who had spent time in one of the worst and cruelest prisons in Romania. They were beyond my level of education, and they were beyond my intellectual level. It was remarkable, and this was not uncommon in Romania. A Central European or Eastern European, Northern European intellectual could take their place anywhere, in any salon, in any European capital, and hold their own and stand out.
I was wondering how the book's been, how it was received at the time of publication, and what sort of feedback you've received on it since, and also whether it's been translated into Romanian yet.
Right. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was first published in a longer form by Contemporary Literature Press, but only as an ebook. It wasn't published as a paperback copy. And I believe I had asked Lydia Vianu to put my email address in the book so that if anybody wanted to contact me, they could. And nobody did. It was downloaded. You can see it. It's still on Contemporary Literature Press well over 1,000 times, but nobody contacted me. And several years later, when I reduced it in size and published it as the Kilt Behind the Curtain, I believe my email address is in there as well. And I have had almost no response whatsoever. It does not sell widely. None of my books sell widely. And it has not been translated into Romanian. And I'm just guessing that it is not of sufficient interest to, somebody mentioned, was it, seems like the name has gone, but one of the questions, Caroline, maybe, no.
Alina, maybe.
The question was it? The book doesn't show up. Yes, young people don't read. They're not particularly interested. And my book is not informative in an academic way or an intellectual way. It is rather simply what I have tried to record as my personal reactions and personal experiences to a wide variety of incidents that I had to face and overcome and encounter while I was there for the 2 years. So I got a huge amount from being in Bucharest, from being in Romania, an enormous amount from being in Romania. I'm still in touch with one of my students, well, two of my students. I'm still in touch with the student I was unable to recommend for the scholarship. And I was sorry not to be able to recommend her for the scholarship, but she didn't have the social skills that I thought would allow her to live successfully in Britain for a year or for 2 years. And I'm still in touch with M, the young lady I made friends with in my second year there. Now, M is what, I'm 83, so M must be close to 80 years old or in their late 70s, and we're still in touch as good friends.
I think it's precisely the fact that it isn't historical or academic account, and it is a collection of what appears to be random memories that actually attracted me to the book in itself, because it is a different lens on a number of things that I have heard throughout my childhood that just puts things into perspective. And Alina's saying in the chat, it's true that young people don't read, but maybe we could get you invited to speak to podcasts like this, or maybe other educational events, because gaining perspectives, and I tend to say this, learning my history through the eyes of a foreigner is
Yes,
actually extremely valuable. It's extremely rich because it just adds color and context to a lot of the events that were only seen from a single point of view, from a single
yes.
angle. Um, I think
Well,
Alina
you
was
mentioned,
gone.
you made a very important point there, that it is almost not quite a random, it's probably chronological stories. But when Dino Sandulescu read it, he said it's difficult to classify. And Dino was a scholar. He was a Joycean scholar, probably one of the best known Joycean scholars in the world. And he used the word spiquiri, spiquiri,
Speakwiri.
uh,
Yes, absolutely.
din Historia Catedrae de Inglesa a Universitatea Bucuresti. That is the subtitle he gave it. Speak, and I remember talking to him about it, and he said it's not a memoir, Ron. It's spiquiri. I don't know how to say it in English.
So it's essentially
Yeah.
not quite a glimpse, but it's a collection of glimpses picked,
Yes.
cherry picked
Yes.
from your from your brain. It's amazing, and absolutely, Speakwiri is spot on. But you're right, there isn't an equivalent
Dino
in
was
English.
always spot on. I don't know if his name is still remembered in Romania, but his name was George Sandulescu, a very, very fine scholar indeed. And as I say, he became the first and founding director of the library, the Grace Kelly Memorial Library in Monaco.
I have a question for you because
Yes.
I think you have a really healthy sense of humor as a Scot. Um, I am wondering, I think you're alluding into the book in not so many words. You're definitely describing some of the behavior that the young ladies have, generally speaking. But if you were to explain Romanian humor or Romanian irony to someone who has never set foot in the country, how would you describe it?
What are you thinking of? Can you give me a closer idea of
I'm
what
from
you're?
Ploiești, so I
Yes.
will have my own version of that. So
Well, I have a
my
very good friend from Ploiești, Doina Leca, who now lives in Montreal, and we've talked a great deal. So just give me a little bit of an idea of what is in the back of your
so
mind there.
the particular part in the book is the way that the young ladies would tease you
Oh,
and
okay.
your Presbyterian education. So that's
Yes,
one
yes,
example. Um, but for me, it's just I think it's the difference between the black humor that you would encounter in
yes.
England, the dry humor, and the more incisive humor that you would definitely get in Ploiești.
Yes, well, I think my Scottish background and the particular background I had, because it wasn't maybe 100% of Scots, was quite narrow in many senses. It was relatively narrow in the moral sense, in the ethical sense. You were brought up to be obedient and respectful of women. And when you started going out with a young lady, you were taught to respect the young lady. And so when I got to Bucharest, and my students who were I was 24, 25, they would be 18, so they were 5 or 7 years younger. They would talk about things that embarrassed me, or they would tell jokes that, frankly, I found embarrassing. I wouldn't have told in mixed company in Scotland. So it was something, it was difficult to get used to, but I did get used to it. And I had a bit of an insight into their lives. Um, they there's a word that I came across, aventura, if I remember correctly. And I remember someone, it was one of the male professors, saying to me that he was late for an appointment with me because of O Aventura. And I said, what do you mean? And he explained to me, and I found it quite shocking, actually. It was a casual affair. Um, and I found that quite shocking. But in Romania at that time, and of course, if you read what's that wonderful account of the German writer who lived in the Athene Palace for a year before Romania came into the war, while the king was still in power. Um, Europe was probably more sexually liberated than Scotland was. That's probably all I can say.
Well, I do have a couple more questions, but I mean, how are you feeling about taking
I'm
any more
fine.
questions?
I'm on my own just now because my wife is busy doing something else. So I'm not in a hurry.
Well, I just wondered if you could elaborate on the anecdote about Charles de Gaulle's visit to Bucharest in 1968.
Oh, that was, it took me by surprise. Obviously, it was not something I had set up, but I had been given access to a Land Rover by one of the British guards at the British Embassy. And these were guards who were guards internally in the embassy. The guard was externally guarded by Romanian soldiers. But I could never make the Land Rover work. And it always ran out of gas after about 3 or 4 minutes. And I just couldn't figure out what had gone wrong with it. And one day I had a holiday from university. The university was closed and I couldn't remember why. And I got onto the Land Rover with the manual, and I discovered what was wrong, and I fixed it. And I was so pleased, and I noticed there was so little diesel in the Land Rover that I decided to go to a gas station that I knew of up near the Parcul Erestrau and fill up with gasoline. And I did. I drove up, but the roads were empty. I couldn't figure out why the roads would be so empty. There were usually buses, these concertina buses, and there were tram cars, but there was nothing on the roads. I filled up with gas, I turned round, and I'm coming back down towards Piazza Romana. Aviatorilor, that's about where I was. And there were crowds of people now down the side of the boulevard. And I thought, my goodness, what has happened? Has there been a revolution? Ceausescu is no longer in power. And I was uh, pounced upon by the militia on motorbikes who took me to park at one side of the road. And I was given a flag to wave, and I noticed it wasn't the Romanian flag. So I thought, my goodness, there has been a revolution. Somebody from outside the country, some exile, has come back and they're taking over as president. And sure enough, down the road came a huge car with a man standing up in military uniform. And I thought, I'm seeing something wonderful. Ceausescu has been overthrown, and this is the new president. It was the first visit of a Western premier since the war, and it was Charles de Gaulle standing up in that car. And I had almost destroyed his parade by being illegally on the route that he was taking from Otopeni Airport to the Communist Party headquarters on Balcescu.
Serena, did you have any other questions? Otherwise, I think I'm just down to my last couple before we
Go
ask
for it, go for it.
Um, so I was wondering about what you say in terms of the importance of you found of querying secondhand assertions, and you say a healthy skepticism was my most valuable survival tool when you were in Romania at this time.
Yes, yes. I think I found that I've always been one to triangulate information. If somebody tells me something, I don't believe it right away. I wait until either I can confirm it, either from another person or myself, or from a book, or from another source. And I found that most important in Romania, or I became more aware of it in Romania, that Romanians were not upfront with me. They couldn't be upfront with me. And some of them obviously were required to report on what I planned to do. They would ask me, "What are you doing this weekend?" And I thought, well, they're trying to, they'll go off to the base and they'll say, "Well, I just spoke to Mackay, and as part of my responsibility as a professor, I'm telling him that he's going to be in Predeal this weekend." Um, but no, I'm handling the question not very well. I'm giving it from a different perspective. I'm responding in a way that I responded to other people. If people told me something, if Romanians told me something, I tended to check it to see if it were accurate, because sometimes I would be told things just for their convenience, or in order to be lured into giving them something. Quite often, Romanians would, they needed things, they wanted things, they saw things that they couldn't have. And I was one channel by means of which they might be able to obtain something that they wanted. And so they would come and, from my point of view, uh, duplicitly make friends with me. Not even friends, it was just a casual gesture so that I would respond in kind. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, I'm just interested in anything you have to say in response to it. So if that's,
Hmm.
that's a good enough answer for me, absolutely.
It kind of, if I can jump in there, it kind of responds to what I said earlier. You would, as a minimum, offer a vantage point that they wouldn't otherwise have. So you were able to open a horizon that was completely opaque in other settings. So seeing the world, hearing you talk, um, would I from everything that I read in the book, everybody was essentially absorbing like a sponge and extracting and drying you out of any piece of information, feeling,
Hmm.
experience, or anything like that, simply because there was no other source.
Yes, yes. You often didn't know why something was being done. You didn't get to the bottom of things very clearly or very well, because people couldn't be upfront, because they didn't expose what the real reason was, or what the real purpose was, or what the real motivation was. That there was constant fear is the wrong word, because it gives the West a strange impression. It was the utmost care. They took the utmost care to protect themselves.
And protect you in the process as
Yes,
the valuable source of continued information. Because if they didn't take that care, then potentially you would have been removed, and therefore
yes.
that would stop. So it was a two-way street. But it wasn't
Hmm.
just fear or care. The way that I would interpret it is shame, the shame of not knowing, the shame of not not being as cool or as educated as you were. And although you're describing Romanians are very educated themselves
Yes,
and able to hold their own in high circles, etc., most of the people I know very much have a chip on their shoulder of not having had access to as
yes,
much education as most people. So I think one of the things that is very hard for other people to understand is the fact that they would have taken all of this information and unpacked it at home
yes,
to the level of detail that I think appears in one of the Cold War conversations with Irina Nistor.
yes.
To the nth degree, you would watch a movie or you would listen to a story, and it wasn't the subject that matters. It was all of the details, the kind
The
of food that
subtext. Yes,
they write, they
yes.
had the way that they would decorate their homes, etc. All of these details would be taken from your conversation and unpacked at home and talked
Hmm.
about it for weeks and months on end.
Your point about shame, I remember fishing on uh, the lakes not far from Ploiești. I've forgotten the name, but I was fishing with uh,
Nago?
Zamfirescu, Domnul Zamfirescu,
Okay.
and he had told his friend a lie that he wasn't going to fish that day because I had forced myself on him. I'd obliged him to take me with him. It was a time when I felt I really have to push Romanians a little bit. And I had invited myself to fish with him. And he must have called his friend to say, I can't go this weekend, thinking that his friend would cancel. And he met his friend in the middle of the lake and was obviously incredibly embarrassed and incredibly ashamed of the circumstances that made it impossible for him to invite me, first of all, to fish with him and his friend at the same time. Because maybe he couldn't trust his friend entirely either. And maybe if he invited me, then his friend would have reported on him for having invited me. So these were all the little Russian dolls within the Russian dolls. But I remember him saying something in Romanian, and I've forgotten the quote in Romanian, but he said it was, a bowed head is not cut off by the sword.
Capul
Now,
plecat, nu-l taie sabia.
that
Sabia
is
nu-l
it.
taie. Yes.
And as he said that, he was a handsome man. He was from Maramuresh. Had been an aristocrat. He was wearing a beautiful 40-year-old, 50-year-old Taras tweed jacket. And when he said that, a bowed head is not cut off by the sword, I could see the shame in his face. What he was saying was, this is how we are forced to live. This is how I survive.
Yeah.
This is
Spot on.
what young people wouldn't understand. This is the 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 depth of horror that totalitarianism brings. It is knowing that you bow your head simply in order not to have it cut off.
Yeah. I think that is absolutely spot on. And it's a chilling message to end up on. I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that we have come to know your book through the Cold War Conversations, which is a podcast. I think I listened to it on Spotify, but I'm sure it's available on other channels. So I will put a link in the chat for
Good.
that.
Yes.
But it's an excellent account that you give there of your own experience, so it's worth listening there as well. As far as I'm concerned, there's a quote that you mention on page 266. There is no law that would prevent a man from meeting evil with evil. And I think That's very much my own experience of my country and
Yes.
of communist Romania. I wouldn't even necessarily say communist Romania, of Romania between 49 and
Yes.
89, because doctrine was very much of a front.
Yes. Yes.
It was a combination of both
Hmm.
nationalism and communism. It was almost the third way put into practice.
Hmm.
I was wondering, Nicola, did you have any further questions?
No, no, I don't think so. I mean,
Okay.
as you say, you're retired, and I was just wondering if you were working on anything else at the moment in terms of written work, but otherwise, that was my last question.
Yes, I'm always writing. I publish usually short stories on a blog, which turns into an anthology called Fred's Blog. And I'm also writing a book in Spanish, but my strategy is I write in English first, then I translate it into my version of Spanish. I'm not a native Spanish speaker. And then I have an editor in Tenerife who turns it into Tenerife Spanish. And uh, my wife and I will launch that book this winter in Tenerife. And it's about very simple people in a very simple village that hasn't changed all that much on the north shore of Tenerife, where there's no golden beach and where it rains a couple of times a day and where the wind blows in constantly from the Atlantic. It's not the place that people go to to get a suntan in 10 days.
I have two more weird questions for you. So, hopefully very short ones. If you had to capture Romania of the 60s in a single smell or taste or sound, what would you choose?
I think I would choose a day when I came down off the Bucegi Plateau through a valley I had never passed before, and it was called Valea Cerbului.
Mm.
It was the most beautiful valley I have ever been in. It was forested with mature beech trees, and the smell of the beech mast was something that I had never experienced before because I had never seen a beech forest. I had seen beech trees, but I don't think in Britain or certainly in Scotland there's no such thing as a beech forest. And Valia Cerbului and the smell of beech mast beginning to that lovely earthy rotting smell in the fall is the essence, one of the essences. There would be many, many, many more. One of the essences of the beauty of Romania for me.
As far as I'm concerned, you can come back whenever you want. That is one of my favorite memories of home. So thank you very much for that. And last but not least, you've lived and worked across the globe, but if Romania had a single export beyond trade goods, um, and poorly canned goods, as you mentioned earlier, something intangible, um, what do you think that would be?
I would say attention to detail. While I was in Romania, it was common for Romanians to claim to be Latin, more like the Italians, more like the Spanish, more like the Portuguese. And I had lived and worked in some of these countries. And it was true that there were some Latin characteristics in Romania, and of course the language as well, because it was the outpost of the Roman Empire, the eastern outpost of the Roman Empire. But Romanians had something that Latins do not possess in Europe or in Latin America: attention to detail. Romanians had enormous ability to pursue something until they had mastered it, until they had understood it, until they had captured it, and until they had actually made it their own.
You
Well, from a
hold
light-hearted
sorry, Nicola, you hold dangerous levels of psychological understanding into the Romanian culture. Go on, please.
No, I was just saying from a light-hearted point of view, and attention to detail, I thought it was funny the way you said that Romanians could spot foreign shoes from a mile off. That made me laugh.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. That's the last thing I was able to buy, you see, because it wasn't easy to buy shoes in Romania. In fact, you couldn't go in and buy shoes. What you did was, as soon as a truck rolled up to a shoe shop, people surrounded it, so shoes were sold in the box off the back of the truck. And you didn't ask for a pair of shoes, you simply took a box and then you took it away, 50 or 60 yards, and you started exchanging it with other people who had also bought a box until you found what it was that you wanted. And you made your swap with the person who had got something that you wanted, and you had something that they wanted. So
Yeah.
shoes were hard to come by. I could dress as a Romanian, but Romanians were so quick they could spot you a mile away by your shoes. And then a communist would come up to you in the street, and he would be usually a working man type communist, the kind of brutal type who might have been a prison guard. And they would look at you and they would ask you for a light. Tavares, comrade, give me a light. I don't remember what it was. What was it? How would you say that? Give me a light, comrade, in Sorina, in Romanian?
Brichetta?
No, no,
Brichetta,
it was
no?
a
Un foc.
phosphor,
Hai un foc? Un foc?
phosphorus. I don't remember, but that
Foc
would
is a light, is
a
fire.
light.
So we wouldn't
Yes,
say light in Romanian for those that smoke. It's foc
yes.
because
It would because
yeah,
they would have their cigarette, and
yeah.
you knew that they'd spotted you and that they were working members of the Communist Party, so they could treat you like that and call you
Alina's
comrade.
suggesting kibrit. Hai un kibrit?
I think it was.
That's
I
a
think it was.
match. That's a match.
Yeah, that's exactly. Hebrit Tovarish.
Mm-hmm.
And they would hold their cigarette up to you for a light. Hebrit, that's exactly it. Yes.
Okay. Well, Alina's inviting you to Bucharest by the sounds of it. So would you be interested to visit again?
I would love to visit again.
Well, maybe we can make that happen. So, one of the last things that we ask anybody that we invite around is to recommend a book about Romania. So you've already spoken about Athene Palace, Hitler's New Order Comes to Romania by I think it's Kaplan, among other authors that
No, no,
contributed to that.
no, it's not that one. Let me
Uh-huh.
see if I have it on my Kindle here. Um, it's edited by a friend of mine. Let me see. Um,
Not a problem. And whilst we're waiting, the next episode that we will have in October is on the 17th, and we will have Professor Ruxandra Trandafoyu talking to us at that point about two of the books that she's published. One of them is Migration, Dislocation and Movement on Screen, and the second one is Border Crossings and Mobilities on Screen. So all about migration and dislocation, a little bit more of a serious subject, shall we say, next month, but still very much interesting, and Ruxandra's always easy going.
okay, the title of the book I would suggest is R.G. Waldeck, Waldeck, and it's simply called Athene Palace. And Athene is only spelled with a final E on Athene, not two E's.
Yeah.
And it has been not edited, but represented by the Center for Romanian Studies by a good friend of mine called Ernest H. Latham or Latham Jr. Ernest H. Latham Jr. He has a
Yeah.
brilliant introduction to it, a brilliant introduction.
Yeah, that's precisely the one that I said. The only thing that I made a mistake on is the fact that on the cover it's actually expanded as Hitler's New Order comes to Romania, and it's written by R.G. Waldeck and Robert D. Kaplan.
Okay, so that must be another version of it. I know that Ernest did this only a few years ago. There are several versions of that book. Yes, but I would recommend Ernest's because he was the cultural attaché in the American embassy in the 80s. And unlike most Western diplomats, I think he spent 5 years there. And at the same time, he did a doctorate in the University of Bucharest. And he did it with another friend of mine, Leon Levitsky. Leon Levitsky was a Shakespearean scholar in the department I taught in, a very senior scholar. And that's why I would recommend Ernest Latham's version of the Athene Palace.
I found it on Google Reads, and you're right, they are
Yes.
2 separate books. So thank you very much for that. I'll find the links and I'll post them into the chat.
Now, Ernest has also written or compiled his Securitate dossier. After he left Bucharest and went back to Washington, he requested, after the revolution, he requested his Securitate dossier. And that makes fascinating reading. And he is a wonderful speaker. If you wanted somebody to interview, Ernest is a brilliant speaker.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you very much for that. We'll definitely take note. So thank you very much for the link, Alina. She found it. It's a book that is published and available at Humanitas, which is a Romanian publishing house. And she's actually saying Leon Levitsky's daughter, Veronica, was her teacher and mentor. Small world.
My goodness.
So we definitely have to
Yes.
make this meet happen between yourself and Alina back in Bucharest. Thank you so much for all your time and all your insights. It has been an absolute pleasure hosting you, and
Well,
we
thank
really
you
hope to keep in touch.
for the invitation, and Sorina, and thank you, Nicola, for the questions as well. I appreciated being invited, and best wishes to all of you.
Thank
No,
you.
we've really enjoyed having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Seeing you. Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.